My name is Richard Edmund Robinson, Robinson. I now live on Freeman Drive, Georgetown, South Carolina, on the banks of the Black River. When World War II started, to me, was, I believe, in 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland. And I considered that the start, really, of the war. But that was pretty far back. And if you're referring to Pearl Harbor, then, of course, I was in Greer. We had been to church and had come home and heard the news on the radio. On the event of Pearl Harbor, I was 16 years old, and we had been to church and came home and heard the news on the radio. That afternoon, we went to my mother's home, what we referred to as the farm, as usual, which was a Sunday afternoon practice. But I remember quite well thinking on the trip over, which was some 4 or 5 miles, that the various things that I saw, the whole country was now at war. I was a young 16. I was not concerned about my own involvement in the war at that particular time. At 16, I graduated from high school and went off to Clemson, which was a military school at the time. That is when it occurred to me that I possibly would be involved in the war, that it would come to me. Near my 18th birthday, I found a program where I was qualified to go into the Air Corps, it was at that time, as a bombardier, to train to be a bombardier. And I went to Camp Croft in Spartanburg to take the physical for that program. And the minimum weight requirement was 115 pounds. I weighed 113. So I didn't qualify because of a 2-pound weight shortage. And even though to me it seemed that a bombardier, they would want him as small as they could get. On return home, I then simply had to wait for the draft, which I got my greetings from the president on New Year's Day of 1944. I was ordered to Columbia, Fort Jackson, to take the physical, and I weighed the minimum, which must have been 114, because that's about what I weighed at the time. And then, after being taken in there, I was sent home until February the 10th of 1944, at which time I was sent to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and inducted. And from Fort Bragg, I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, because I had been assigned to armored training. Went overseas in September the 29th of that same year, 1944. The basic training and so forth was accomplished. D-Day happened when I was in the final stages of training, basic training in armored warfare. And I was sent to Camp Boyd, Texas. Well, first of all, I was sent to Fort Meade, Maryland, as a replacement in armor. In the meantime, some of the news of the really rather horrifying experiences in replacement depots, or depots as we called them then, had come out, and I think the news reporters had reported the situation, and General Eisenhower, as I understand it, passed an edict that nobody would go overseas as a replacement until he was 19 years old. So I was then sent from Fort Meade to a unit in Camp Boyd, Texas, the 13th Armored Division. I was there about a month and then was sent to the 11th Armored Division at Camp Cook, California, as a filler, that is, to bring them up to strength to go overseas. So they robbed the 13th, and I was sent to the 11th, and I was really right glad of it, because the 13th was a strange outfit to me. And the 11th then eventually became my home. So by the end of September, we had been shipped by troop train across the country to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, which is at the POE at New York. And then on the 29th, we joined the convoy to Liverpool, England. Half the division was assigned to a British transport, HMT Samaria, and we arrived in Liverpool on or about Columbus Day of 1944. And then our particular battalion, a tank battalion, was sent to a little place near Warminster on the Salisbury Plains. And it was a battalion-sized camp, which was spread through the countryside for obvious reasons, to not concentrate heavily, so the enemy could close us out as a division. So it was a spreading out of the unit, and we stayed in the small battalion-sized camp called Camp Nook, and it was a little nook, until we were transferred over to the Warminster Barracks, which was an armored permanent location. There we received our tanks, half-tracks, and equipment and so forth, and began to prepare it for combat service. Well, first of all, our general was a benign general, which we were fortunate to have, and the troops loved him. He made it possible for as many people as possible to go into London or Bristol on the weekends, have time to see the country, and it was an educational benefit that not every trooper had. So we were grateful to General Kilburn, who was the division commander at that time, for giving us that opportunity. In December the 16th, we had moved from Warminster down to Weymouth, where we boarded LST, landing craft tank, rather, and shipped across the English Channel and enjoyed some of the Navy's good food, which was a good thing we did, because it was a long time before we had food that good again. We landed at Cherbourg on December the 17th, I believe. We left on the 16th, and I believe it may have been the 17th before we debarked the LST and began our northbound road march to combat. At the time, December the 16th, you probably don't recall, but I do vividly, that is the time that the Ardennes offensive by the Germans was started, AKA the Battle of the Bulge. And so that is where we got our baptism of fire. We went from Cherbourg to Sedan, and our first objective was to defend the Meuse River. And then is when we began our combat duty. Actually, there was the Germans didn't reach the Meuse during that attack. They got near the Meuse, and I've forgotten the name of the town now, but we got our baptism of fire on the 30th. My personal one was, I think, on the 31st, because I remained in the attack position on the 30th, and one of the line companies jumped off on the 30th. I was assigned to the mortar platoon in a tank battalion, which is somewhat unusual. All my training had been in tanks, and then I waked up one morning and discovered I was a mortarman. So the December the 30th was our official day, but the day most memorable to me was on December 31st, a New Year's Day, a New Year's Eve, rather, on the last day of 1944. The day itself started rather well, in that we gained, I would guess, probably 500 or 600 yards, which if you've been stalemated or going backwards, that can be a nice reversal of things. The engagement was heavy. The infantry got into the village of Chinon, a small village in the Bastogne perimeter. And they really could not secure the town, the village, by nightfall. So the rest of the task force, of which they were part, and our tank battalion was part, joined, and we coiled or circled on top of the ridge at the edge of the village. The Germans were seasoned troops. We were green, and it was really our first engagement. And the seasoned troops of the Germans let us circle and form our wagons in a circle, so to speak, get all of the equipment off of our vehicles to begin digging in. There's shovels and picks, and at that particular time, you sometimes had to get an axe to break through the frozen ground. And we got all of that off. The gasoline trucks had come up to resupply the vehicles and that sort of thing. And then they opened up all at once. And really, before they opened, I thought to myself, I'm on the wrong side of this hill. We were on the side, I happened to be in the arc of the circle, on the half of the circle that was facing the Germans in the village, and they were very disciplined, and they opened up all at once, and it was, I don't know, I guess the best way to express it would be chaotic, because we had our stuff spread out, and equipment and so forth, the gasoline trucks there and so forth. But I can tell you this, it didn't take long to get on the reverse slope of that hill. When the Germans opened up, my friend and I dropped to the ground, and we rolled under the half track, which was our mortar squad. The Germans' mortars, among all this other firing, you could see a pattern develop where the Germans were using a ladder system which creeps up, and you can tell what their target is by the direction it moves. And in the snow, you could see the rounds hitting. As they came closer and closer, then we knew, he knew, Bill Katz and I were lying under the half track with the pattern coming toward the half track. We knew then that the round would hit either on his side of the half track or on my side of the half track or in the half track, none of which was good. But in my instance, it turned out to be to my advantage, or so I thought anyway, that the round hit on Bill Katz's side of the half track. And he was hit. I pulled him out on my side of the half track, which was away from the enemy, and called for the medic. In the meantime, I took Katz's first aid pouch and looked for the wound on his body, and it was very cold weather, and it took some doing to get down to the his flesh, and I finally found a place that I thought was the most, well, I thought it was the wound, and I applied the compress on his wound. and he kept saying, "It gurgles." And I knew where I placed that compress, there should be no gurgling sound. The medic was on the way, and when he arrived, he immediately looked at cats and kept searching until he found about an inch square hole in his left side, and apparently it had punctured his lung, but I don't know that for sure. But that's why it gurgled. And for the life of me, at the moment, I can't think of the medic. Henricus, his name was Max. The medic was Max Henricus, and the medics, our medics, were extraordinary in that they promised us, regardless of where we were, if we were hit, regardless of where we were, they would be to us within 10 minutes. And as far as I know, they never missed that goal, and in most cases were much less than that. When the war ended, I eventually transferred to Vienna to 5th Army headquarters, Mark Clark's G2 section. And they, whoever they are, I don't remember, said if I would sign to stay at least 3 more months, they would give me the rank. Well, I wasn't going to take a chance on staying three more months. If my turn came to go home, I'd rather go home than the rank didn't mean anything anyway then. So when I was discharged, there was no point in staying in. I had no rank or anything, and I probably wouldn't have anyway. So I went home and went back to school and graduated and went to work for Pacific Mills in Columbia. And the superintendent of the mill was my battalion commander in World War II. And through just sheer dumb luck. And so one day I asked him, he was the plant superintendent, I said, why didn't I get my rank as message center chief? He said, don't worry about that. I said, I'm going to get you a direct appointment. If we get in war again, you may as well go back. We'll all have to go, and you may as well go back as an officer. By then, he was a full colonel in the reserves, and so I said okay, because I needed the extra money anyway. So, and you'd take 2 weeks and go to camp, which was kind of fun. So he got me a direct commission in armored cavalry, and that's how I got my commission. And then, less than a year later, I was back on active duty because they needed second lieutenants, and he would love to have been back on active duty as a full colonel, and they didn't need full colonels, didn't want them. Of all the interviews and so forth that I had seen, and even in talking to people, one of the things that I found the most meaningful in retrospect to me was the anxiety of the prelude to the baptism of fire. And in that, there's a piece in there, I think, in the back part of that thing that I wrote on that. I can write it much better than I can speak it. But that anticipation was when you had the question in your mind, can I do it? The feeling really, I think, for most people, and I presume probably most people had the same feeling that I did, although I never shared mine with anybody, and nobody shared theirs with me. But I think coincidentally we were going through somewhat the same process. But it began really when we were preparing to leave Camp Cook, California, because at that point, although we were not given a destination per se, it was pretty clear that armored divisions would go to the ETO, the European Theater of Operations. When you cross the United States on a troop train from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, it tends to confirm your thinking that sure enough, you're headed toward Europe. When you get on a boat and the boat sails east, then you're reasonably sure, without anybody coming in and saying, okay, you're going into combat in Europe. It was pretty obvious then. We didn't know that we would go to Liverpool, which we did, and things begin to build. And you know now at last, after all the training, you know the training is behind, and you know where you're headed. The time in England was spent decosmolining equipment and so forth, and getting new equipment ready for combat. We crossed the Channel at the same time the Germans started the Ardennes offensive. We didn't know that. We didn't know they'd done that. We didn't know where our destination would take us. As it was, we were in the assigned to Patton's Third Army, which was suddenly assigned to take the thrust of the Ardennes offensive, the German offensive, and meet it and turn it back, which we became part of. Now, going from England, from Weymouth to Cherbourg, you begin to see and feel things that in a more or less surreal manner. It's happening. You've heard Edward R. Murrow say name such places as Falaise, St. Lo, the other places in Normandy. And heretofore, that was Edward R. Murrow saying it. Suddenly you're seeing signs to those very same places, and it begins to sink in that you're here. You're where you are, and it's real. You go through Paris, and you look at you go through around the Arc de Triomphe, and the people on the street were still friendly then because Paris had only been liberated a short months ago. And you wave, it was more or less casual. It wasn't wasn't a liberation day. And you were only passing through. But you look over on the left and there's the Eiffel Tower. The only place I'd ever seen the Eiffel Tower was in a geography book. And then we bivouacked one night in Chateau Thierry, a World War I battlefield. We were headed to the Meuse River at Sedan, and the overlying feeling, well, in the meantime too, first you see the flashes at night of artillery on the front, and then the next night you not only see the flashes, but you hear the roar of the artillery pieces. You hear the sound. And more poignant, I guess you'd say, would be all along through France. You saw the lines of the roads lined with poplar trees. And you would begin to see temporary makeshift graves on the bank with an inverted M1 with a helmet on it, and sometimes maybe a hole through the helmet. The armored pieces or the destroyed pieces had been pushed aside so you could get through. And they were beginning to rust and that sort of thing. But the closer you got, once we got into Belgium, when we crossed the Meuse at Sedan and entered into Belgium, then we still saw wrecked armored vehicles, but this time they were occupied, but the crew members were no longer living. Then, in my mind, the most vivid thing is to see the ambulances and the jeeps with the litters with wounded Americans coming back from the front. And then all this time it begins to build, can I take it? Or will I fold and turn to jelly or what? And I never discussed it with anybody else. Nobody else told me their thoughts on that. But the prelude to the baptism of fire was one of the most indelible memories that I have from the combat experience. In England, somebody was wise enough to take us out in the field. I guess they were wise to take us out into the field, and it was a second lieutenant who had a Purple Heart ribbon pinned on a field jacket, which normally isn't done, but for emphasis, I guess, they they had this fellow give a class on the psychological effect that we would see in combat. And he said the Germans have said two things that the GIs have trouble adjusting to, and we want you to experience one of them at least. He said the 88 artillery piece is one of the things that has a demoralizing effect, which may have been an understatement. And the other is the German machine gun. Our cyclic rate of fire was much slower than theirs, and I've forgotten the numbers of each one, but all I can think of was what I thought at the time when they took us out on the slopes in England to demonstrate the German machine gun. And they had an American machine gun, a German machine gun. They fired the American .30 caliber machine gun, and it had a staccato, regular sort of a even beat. And then they fired the German machine gun, which sounded more like a motor than a machine gun. And I thought to myself, my gracious, that thing must be spraying bullets all over the place. So the next round that the lieutenant had his demonstrator fire, I looked at the impact area, which was a grassy knoll, and it looked like somebody suddenly harrowed, just really chopped up a very small, concentrated area, just filled with bullets. And I thought at the moment that I heard my mother calling, telling me to come home. And it was indeed a shock. The next thing that was shocking, which is more in line with your question, was on the occasion of seeing dead soldiers. The enemy soldiers dead had no effect, but to see an American GI dead was a terrible experience. Immediately you could see mothers, wives, children, that sort of thing. With the German, that's just the way it was. People say to me sometime, I think they want to be benevolent, and they say, well, in your case it was either killed or be killed, wasn't it? And my answer is no. That's what we were trying to do. We were trained to kill. We were trying to win. And war is a messy, cruel, terrible way to settle differences. But after your training, that's just the way it was. If you better win. Holiday Hill was our baptism of fire. I named it, and it stuck somehow. I said the Germans had the holiday, but in the end we had the hill. So we called that little area Holiday Hill, and it was referred to by many of our troops to this day. After the Ardennes offensive, which lasted until, for our part, to the middle of January, and then some. But we went into reserve, and after that, we the tankers were, the 3 battalions of tanks were held back, while the 3 battalions of infantry, plus support from artillery, cracked the Siegfried line. So we spent time in Luxembourg repairing roads, corduroy roads and so forth, while the infantry broke through the Siegfried line. And then from there on, we had first the race to the Rhine River in the vicinity of Brohl, B-R-O-H-L, I believe, Germany. Then we were brought back through the Moselle pocket where the Germans had been cut off. We came back through that, the Moselle pocket being along the Moselle River. Then we went through there back and looped back to the Rhine again and crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim near Frankfurt or Worms. And then from then on it was what we called exploitation. That is, you'd get up in the morning and you would take off and in an armored column and go until you met resistance. And generally it was, most of the time from then on, it became comparatively small resistant roadblocks and that sort of thing. You'd be impeded, but you kept moving until we got near the Czech border and moved along it down into the redoubt. And again, you met more resistance near the end of the war. Down, our final objective was Linz, Austria, and which is on the Danube, and we crossed the Danube there into Linz, who negotiated an open city, and the Austrians pulled down the German flags and had the Austrian flags out and threw flowers on us and that sort of thing. And at that point, the division overran the Mauthausen concentration camp, and it was liberated. I was moved to Message Center as the war ended, just a day or two after the war ended. And somebody, I've forgotten who, said that they were going to the concentration camp, which was news. We had no idea it was there. And they said, "You want to go?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd like to go." And he said, "Okay, go down to the medics and get a typhus shot, and I'm going up there in a couple of hours." I said, "Never mind," because I didn't want to take the typhus shot, so I never did go to the prison camp itself. When the war ended, actually, of course, it was as though somebody had lifted a burden from your back, and the strangest thing happened. Everybody turned on their lights at night as the trucks, and I remember seeing one coming down the side of a mountain, and it was an absolutely beautiful sight to see a truck coming down the road with its full headlights on. But the next day, my platoon leader sent our crew and a Jeep, I don't know who it was, in effect a small patrol, to a nearby crossroads, because intelligence had reported that there was a company of German soldiers who wanted to surrender in a patch of woods near a crossroad. So they sent us to accept the prisoners and bring them back in. Nobody wanted to die that day. So having lived through the war, we were a little cautious. So we went to the road, and there was an old gentleman with a long beard and a Tyrolean pipe, a typical looking grossing fodder. And so Vogel, who could speak German, a mail clerk was along as an interpreter, and he questioned the old gentleman, and he said, we've been told there's a company of Germans down in that woods. And the old gentleman confirmed it and said there had been, at least the day before, or maybe sometime that morning, I don't know. So he said, our interpreter said, were they armed? Did they have their weapons with them? And the old gentleman said, yes, they did. And we said, auf Wiedersehen, and left. What happened to that company of Germans down in the woods, they may still be there as far as we know. Actually, they would have been wise to come on in, because the consequences were to surrender to the Russians, which they knew better than. The monetary value of wounds, and I believe I said a minute ago, and perhaps needs clarification. You wanted a wound which was classified $1 million wound, because $1 million wound would get you back home in reasonable shape. A $10,000 wound would give you enough to collect your insurance, your death insurance. That's what everybody had, a policy for $10,000. And so that became known as a $10,000 wound. During World War II, I was discharged on Easter Sunday in 1946. I went to work for, well, first of all, I went back to Clemson and for my last 3 years, and graduated with a degree in textiles, and went to work with Pacific Mills in Columbia. As luck or fate would have it, my plant superintendent in Columbia was my battalion commander during all my experience with the 11th Armored Division. So one day I asked him why I didn't get my rating when I became message center chief in Austria. He said, don't worry about that, I'm going to get you a direct commission. Which he did. So I was commissioned second lieutenant, armored cavalry. Less than a year later, well, in the first place, the condition, he said, was that if we had to go to war again, I may as well go back as an officer, which I agreed to. Less than a year later, the Korean conflict occurred. I went back on active duty. The colonel, Colonel Wingard, would like to have gone back on active duty, but as the situation was such that they needed second lieutenants, not full colonels. So he stayed, and I was, the next thing I knew, I was back on active duty and sent to Camp Polk, Louisiana. When I was called back, I was a member of the 822nd Tank Battalion, which was made up of headquarters and two of the three line companies were from Knoxville, Tennessee, and I was living in and therefore a member of B Company, which was headquartered in Chattanooga. It was part of it, and we were activated and shipped to Louisiana in 1950, and then we trained in Louisiana for about a year, a little over a year, I believe, and then I was sent to Fort Knox for the associate officers training for armor, and then sent to out of that I was sent as a replacement tank platoon leader to Korea. On arriving in Korea, I was assigned to the 25th Infantry Division. And rather than sent to the tank battalion of the 25th Infantry Division, I was sent to the 14th Regiment, to Company B of the 14th Regiment, and given the command of a rifle platoon. I had attached to my unit 4 tanks. The platoon leader of the 4 tanks had been my classmate at Fort Knox just a few months prior to our both winding up in Mundung Valley in Korea. His name was Lieutenant Donald Radcliffe, and he and I formed a very close tank infantry team. He volunteered to go out with me on ambush patrol so he could see what it was like, so he would know how to adjust his tank support to my patrols. Worked out quite well. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Radcliffe was killed in action in Vietnam, which I read in the paper, a Jimmy Breslin article feature one time. I was seated at home reading the paper, and I read of his funeral. He was killed because he was an advance party for the 1st Cavalry Division in Vietnam, because he was in the advance party. He wanted to go out on a helicopter shoot so he would know how to deploy his troops. Quite a coincidence in that he was following the same pattern that we had done in Korea together. I had all my training in the Korean War and World War II in tanks. I only fired 1 round in anger from a tank, And that was when Radcliffe was having a problem. He was losing rounds. I asked him if he knew what a bold range change was, and he didn't. So I asked the gunner to get out and show me where he, just leave the gun set, because they were losing their rounds in the mountain. So I made a bold range change, which is doubling the range he had, and it hit right on target. That's the only shot I fired after all the experience in tank. However, the platoon leader that I had in that rifle platoon, the platoon sergeant that I inherited in that rifle platoon was the best anywhere. That included the North Koreans, the Chinese, the Americans, the Turks, the British, anybody who was there. My platoon sergeant was the best. God gave me that. I think he owed it to me. It was a great learning experience, because I'd learned then and there, whenever anybody's shooting at you, it's the same. When somebody shoots at you, it gets personal. I had a young replacement in Korea who, I think he was from Pennsylvania, someplace. I've forgotten exactly. Unfortunately, I've forgotten his name, but he was he came to us in reserve, when we were in reserve, and we were up on the rim of the punch bowl, and we had fighting parapets in the trenches up there. And we were hit by the enemy one night, and during the resulting firefight, I approached this young man's fighting parapet, and he was very excited, and he was feeling around and looking, and I said, "What are you looking for?" And he said, "Grenades." He said, "Grenades, where are the grenades?" And I said, "Well, they're right by your shoulder, but don't throw one." He wanted to throw an illumination grenade to light up the area, but unfortunately it would light him up, and he didn't realize that. So as far as I know, we never ever threw one, but there they were, and he said in utter disbelief, he said, "Sir, they're shooting at me. They're shooting at me." And I know exactly how he felt. It's a personal thing. I was in Korea about 5 months, more or less. A very short tour. We got married in '53. Betty and I, well, I lived on South Main Street in Greer in the first block. She lived in the second block of North Main, so I didn't travel very far. But I am 3 years older than she, and in grammar school, 3 years was a big difference. So we didn't notice each other much in the earlier years. You know, it's been a long time, 3 years. Times have changed. You have more political correctness than you had then. And you tend to think, maybe I was, maybe I was more liberal than I think I was. But really, we weren't. We were trying to win a war. And as I mentioned earlier, the statement that it was either killed or be killed didn't apply in my case anyway. Maybe it does in some people's case. I'm sure it does in some people's cases. But in mine, it simply didn't. We were trying to win, and the way you win a war is kill the enemy. The best way to be able to do that is not consider them much at all, really. But as far as the minute the war ended, with some notable exception, such as the SS troops in Germany, we held in low regard. But you could hardly find a Nazi after the war ended in Germany anyway. But in business, our company did a lot of work with a Japanese friend of mine now. He was a kamikaze pilot. They said, well, if he's a kamikaze pilot, how come he's living? He said it was attributable to the fact that they took their best pilots first as kamikaze pilots, and it pushed him back because he says his commander didn't think he was much of a bomber pilot, so he made it. But the point I wanted to make was that Shigeru Kono was his name, would come in. He loved to play golf, and I loved to accommodate him. But he came in. I would hear him on the day he was due to come visit. I heard him come into the vestibule of my office one time, and he was singing "Let's Remember Pearl Harbor." So when he came on into my office, I was singing "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, and we'll all go free."